Good evening and welcome to this special presentation of The People Speak. Today we honor a legend, regarded as one of the most notable and highly influential African American women of the 19th century. A woman who was devoted to the anti-slavery movement and traveled this land, denouncing slavery and slavers, advocating freedom, women's rights, women's suffrage, and temperance. A woman by the name of Isabella, whom we've all come to know as Miss Sojourner Truth. Born Isabella, Miss Sojourner Truth was the youngest of 13 children born into slavery in Harley, New York. The year was 1797, and rural areas like Harley were mostly occupied by Dutch families. About 16% of Black New Yorkers who lived in those areas spoke Dutch as their first language. At a young age, Miss Truth was separated from her family. By the time she became a teenager, Miss Truth had already been sold 4 times to a variety of slave masters, some of whom were English and would beat her for her inability to speak their language. Eventually, Miss Truth became bilingual in both Dutch and English. In 1810, Miss Truth became the property of John Dumont, a Dutch parishioner. Miss Truth lived with the Dumont family for several years. During that time, she met and fell in love with a slave named Robert. The relationship was short-lived, however, because Robert's owner forbade him to be with any slave who didn't live on his plantation. As punishment for disobeying his master, Robert received a beating and later died from the injuries he had sustained. Miss Truth eventually married another slave named Thomas. Together they bore 5 children, 3 of which were sold into slavery. In 1799, the state of New York began to legislate the abolition of slavery, although the process of emancipating New York slaves was not completed until July 4, 1827. Like many slaves, Miss Truth longed to be free. The law passed in 1799 should have made her free by the time she reached age 25. But by the time she was 29, she was no closer to her freedom. John Dumont had promised Miss Truth her freedom 1 year before the emancipation occurred. He later revoked his promise after she suffered a hand injury, claiming that it made her less productive. In an autobiography written by Neil Arvin Painter, Miss Truth is described as an extraordinarily proficient worker who would, quote, do a day's work in the house, then go into the fields and work faster than any man, unquote. But regardless of her strengths, Miss Truth continued to endure physical and sexual abuse during her services to many of her slave masters, Mr. Dumont included. In the late 1826, Miss Truth escaped to freedom with her infant child, leaving behind her older children who were not yet legally freed. She found her way to the home of a Quaker family known as the Van Wagners. There she took on their last name. Isaac Van Wagner offered to buy Miss Truth from John Dumont for $20 for the remaining of that year. Miss Truth lived with the Van Wagner until the New York State Emancipation Act was approved in 1827. 1843 was a turning point for Miss Truth. She became a Methodist and changed her name from Isabella, a domestic servant, to Sojourner Truth, a woman whose mission was to sojourn the land and preach God's truth. She began traveling and preaching about the abolition of slavery. She also became involved in moral reform. Later on, she became a Millerite Adventist, but left the Millerites for a while. In 1844, Miss Truth joined the Northampton Association of Education and Industry in Northampton, Massachusetts. The organization supported women's rights and religious tolerance, as well as pacifism. While there, Miss Truth met other reformers and abolitionists such as William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and David Ruggles, to name a few. When the Northampton community disbanded in 1846, Miss Truth's career as an activist and reformer continued to soar regardless. She is said to be one of the several escaped slaves who rose to prominence as an abolitionist leader. By the 1850s, Miss Truth moved to Harmonia, Michigan. That same year, her memoirs, The Narrative of Sojourner Truth, a Northern Slave, was published. She dedicated it to a good friend, Olive Gilbert. In 1951, Miss Truth joined fellow abolitionist George Thompson on a lecture tour through central and western New York State. She spoke to large crowds on the subjects of slavery, human rights, and political equality for all women. However, not everyone embraced some of her opinions. They were considered radical among other abolitionist groups. More of Miss Truth's accomplishments are as follows. She was a huge advocate during the Civil War and helped recruit black troops for the Union Army. In 1864, she was employed by the National Freedmen's Relief Association in Washington, D.C., where she worked diligently to improve conditions for African Americans. In 1865, she attempted to force the desegregation of streetcars in Washington. A major project of Miss Truth's life was her attempt to secure land grants from the federal government for former slaves. She argued that the ownership of private property, particularly land, would give African Americans self-sufficiency and freed them from a kind of indentured servitude to wealthy landowners. It was a project that she pursued for 7 years, but failed because Congress disapproved of it. In 1872, Miss Truth settled in Battle Creek, Michigan. Even in her old age, Miss Truth continued to lecture across America on the subject of women's rights, universal suffrage, and prison reform. She even preached against capital punishment. While always controversial, she was embraced and supported by a community of reformers including Amy Post, Wendell Phillips, William Lord Garrison, Lucretia Mott, and Susan B. Anthony. On November 26, 1883, Miss Sojourner Truth died at her home in Battle Creek, Michigan at the age of 86. She was buried alongside her family at Battle Creek's Oak Hill Cemetery. One of Miss Truth's most famous and first speech was given in May of 1851 at a National Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio. Many of the other speakers at the convention were said to be men. The speech was entitled, "Ain't I a Woman?" And in it, Miss Truth attacked the idea of women being the weaker sex and said that men should not be afraid of women having equal rights to them. Different versions of the speech had been recorded. The first one was published a month later by Marius Robinson, a newspaper editor. He had attended the convention and recorded Miss Truth's words himself. His version of her speech, however, did not include the question, "Ain't I a woman?" The famous phrase appeared in print 12 years later in a different version that was transcribed and published by Frances Gage, who was also present at the convention and so happened to be one of its organizers. Not only did she change the words, but she rendered the speech in a rather crude Southern dialect. Some speculate that Marius Robinson and his newspaper may have cleaned up their version of the speech in fear of, quote, mobbish opponents. Others believe that Frances Gage may have edited her version of it, believing that her reading audience in 1878 would find the words more authentic if they were rendered in Southern dialects. Frances Gage's version of the speech became the historic standard. Many protested years later, claiming that Miss Truth's speech was nothing like, quote, the mock Southern dialects that the careless reporters used. They say that as an older woman, Miss Truth took pride in speaking correct English, and that if she had any dialect at all, it would have been the dialect of the uneducated white people of New York during her time. Nonetheless, Miss Truth's speech is one that will always be remembered. Today, she is credited for being one of the foremost leaders of the abolition movement and an early advocate of women's rights. Although she began her career as an abolitionist, the reform causes she sponsored were broad and varied. Abolition was one of the few causes that Miss Truth was able to see realized in her lifetime. And at this moment, it gives me great pleasure to recite her famous speech, Ain't I a Woman, as it was originally transcribed by Marius Robertson. It's a speech that became a classic women's rights speech, and it continues to impact the life of many who still read it today. I want to say a few words about this matter. I am a woman's rights. I have as much muscle as any man and can do as much work as any man. I have plowed and reaped and husked and chopped and mowed. And can any man do more than that? I have heard much about the sexes being equal. I can carry as much as any man and can eat as much too, if I can get it. I am strong as any man that is now. As for intellect, all I can say is, if a woman have a pint and a man a quart, why can't she have her little pint full? You need not be afraid to give us our rights, for fear we will take too much. For we can't take more than our pint will hold. The poor man seems to be all in confusion and don't know what to do. While children, if you have women's rights, give it to her and you will feel better. You will have your own rights and there won't be much trouble. I can't read, but I can hear. I have heard the Bible and have heard that Eve caused man to sin. Well, if women upset the world, do give her a chance to set it right side up again. The lady has spoken about Jesus, how he never spurned women from him, and she was right. When Lazarus died, Mary and Martha came to him with faith and love and besought him to raise their brother. And Jesus wept, and Lazarus came forth. And how came Jesus into the world? Through God, who created him, and a woman who bore him. Man, where was your part? But the women are coming up, blessed be God, and a few of the men are coming up with them. But the man is in a tight place. The poor slave is on him. Woman is coming on him. He is surely between a hawk and a buzzard. Thank you all for watching. That concludes this segment, and until next time.